He was just a quiet man in a corner booth, laughed at by everyone until a billionaire walked in and changed his life forever. The small bell above the diner door jingled as David stepped inside, brushing a little dust from his worn jacket.
Oh.
The place was warm and filled with the smells of bacon, coffee, and fresh bread. It was the kind of diner where people came every morning, where most customers knew each other's names, and where every laugh or whisper carried across the room. David lowered his head as he walked in, hoping not to draw attention. He wasn't in the mood for stares, but he could already feel eyes on him. His clothes were old, and his boots looked like they had carried him through too many years without rest. He wasn't dirty, just tired. Everything about him showed it. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his face lined with quiet struggle. He made his way to his usual spot, a booth in the corner by the window. That booth was his safe place, far enough from the counter where gossip lived, close enough to the window where he could look out and escape into his thoughts. Behind the counter, Sarah, the young waitress with a bright smile and a kind heart, noticed him immediately. She had been working in the diner for 3 years, and in that time, she had seen plenty of regulars come and go. But David was different. He never complained, never caused trouble, always left a tip no matter how small his meal was. It was something about the way he carried himself, like a man with stories no one else knew. Like someone who had lived a bigger life once, but now wanted to disappear into small-town silence. "Morning, David," she called with cheer, carrying a coffee pot in one hand. He managed a small smile and nodded. "Morning, Sarah." She poured his coffee without asking, already knowing how he liked it black, no sugar, no cream. As she set the mug down, David wrapped his hands around it like it was the only warmth he had. He looked out the window at the gray sky, the little cars rolling past, the people walking quickly as if they all had better places to be. At another booth nearby, 2 young men in work uniforms glanced at him and smirked. One of them whispered something, and the other chuckled. David caught it, though he didn't turn his head. He had grown used to it. People saw the old clothes, the quiet presence, and they assumed. In small towns, assumptions traveled faster than truth. Sarah noticed too, but she ignored them. Instead, she leaned closer to David. "Kitchen just baked fresh biscuits. Want me to bring you some?" "Maybe just one," he replied softly. "You're getting 2, she teased, scribbling on her notepad before walking away. David couldn't help but chuckle under his breath. Sarah had a way of making him feel human when the rest of the room treated him like a shadow. He didn't ask for kindness, but she gave it anyway. As he sat there, he thought about how life had brought him here. There had been better times once, times when people didn't laugh behind his back, when he wasn't just the quiet man in the corner booth. He remembered when he was younger, strong, filled with ambition. But life had a way of stripping things away piece by piece until all that was left was survival. Sarah returned with a plate, 2 golden biscuits, and a small dish of butter. She placed it gently in front of him.
"Eat while they're hot." "Thank you,"
he said, meaning it more. Then she probably realized nearby a group of women in neat dresses were chatting over coffee. One of them, noticing David, lowered her voice, but not enough to hide the edge in her tone. "Does he ever eat anything more than biscuits and coffee? Poor thing must be living on scraps." The table laughed softly. David's hand froze for a second as he reached for his biscuit. He wasn't angry. He was tired. The whispers always felt the same, like little pinches that didn't wound deeply, but never stopped coming. He spread butter on the biscuit and kept his eyes on his plate. Pretending not to hear, Sarah's eyes narrowed as she overheard. She didn't say anything, but she made sure her smile toward David was even brighter, as if to drown out the cruelty around them. When David finished half his biscuit, he shifted slightly in his seat, preparing to stand for a moment. Maybe he needed to stretch his legs or ask for something at the counter. But as he rose, his foot caught the edge of the booth and his knee, already stiff from years of work and wear, gave a little shake. He stumbled, not falling but close enough that his balance betrayed him. The room caught it instantly. A laugh came from one of the young men, sharp and mocking. Another joined in. The sound spread, like a spark catching dry grass. People tried to hide it with coughs or smirks, But the sound of their amusement filled the air. David froze. For a brief second, his face burned with shame. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself, trying to act as though nothing had happened. But he could feel every pair of eyes on him. Every whisper, every smirk. And then Sarah was there. Without hesitation, she rushed over, slipping her arm under his and steadying him as if she'd been expecting it. "Whoa, easy there, champ," she joked lightly, grinning up at him. "What's this? You trying to make me look strong in front of everyone?" David blinked, surprised by her tone. She wasn't embarrassed for him. She was teasing him in a way that made the moment feel smaller, less painful. Some people chuckled. But this time it wasn't cruel, it was because Sarah's energy changed the air. She pretended to flex her arm. "Look at that. I can pick up customers with one hand. Who needs the gym?" David smiled weakly, letting out a breath he hadn't. Realized he was holding. He knew what she was doing. She was pulling him out of the center of their laughter and turning it into something else. The young men still smirked. But their laughter faded when they saw Sarah glaring at them briefly before returning her attention to David. She guided him gently back into the booth. "There you go," she said softly, patting his shoulder. "Don't make me carry you next time, okay?" David chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll try not to." But inside he was grateful. Grateful that in a room full of people who found joy in his stumble, one person chose kindness instead of cruelty. Diner returned to its usual chatter, though the moment lingered in the air like a shadow. People still whispered, still judged. But Sarah's laughter with David had softened it. David picked up his coffee again, sipping slowly. His eyes, usually clouded with quiet sorrow, had a little light in them now. He glanced at Sarah as she moved on to serve another table, her ponytail bouncing as she carried plates with ease. She didn't look back at him, but he knew she had done it all on purpose. For a man who had learned to expect nothing, her small act of kindness was worth more than anyone in that diner could ever guess. And though the world outside that window kept rushing past for a moment, inside the little diner, David didn't feel invisible. David sat quietly in the booth, his coffee cup warm between his hands. The laughter that had followed his stumble still echoed faintly in his mind, though Sarah had softened the sting. He tried to act as if nothing had happened, but he could feel the weight of the stares, the quiet smirks. In a place where everyone knew everyone, moments like these were not forgotten. Easily Sarah returned to check on him, balancing a tray of plates for another table. She gave him a quick smile, the kind of smile that told him she wasn't going to let him sink into his own embarrassment. He nodded back, grateful though he struggled to show it. Across the diner, two of the men who had laughed earlier whispered again. One of them, a tall guy in greasy work boots, leaned toward his friend and said just loud enough for David to hear, "Guess she'll be carrying him out the door next." The two chuckled, and David's shoulders tightened. He didn't respond, but he heard it. He always heard it. Sarah set down the plates at another table, but her eyes darted toward the corner booth. She had caught the comment too. With a flash of irritation, she turned her attention back to David. She wouldn't let them have the last word. Walking back to his booth, she clapped her hands together dramatically. "All right, champ, let's try this again," she said playfully. She stood next to him and offered her arm. "Need me to carry you to the counter?" "Because I can. You saw what I just did, right? I'm stronger than I look." David blinked, caught off guard by her sudden act. A small, embarrassed laugh slipped from his lips. "You don't need to make a scene," he muttered. "But I'm good at making scenes," she said with a wink, loud enough for the two men to hear. "Wait till you see me lift a whole coffee pot in one hand. Olympic level skills right here." A few customers chuckled at her silly tone. This time, the laughter wasn't sharp or cruel. It was lighter, the kind of laughter that lifted the air instead of weighing it down. Sarah leaned down slightly, pretending to flex her arm. "Seriously though, don't test me. I could carry you out like a sack of potatoes if I had to." David shook his head, but the corner of his mouth curved into a smile. It had been a long time since he'd smiled in front of other people. The men at the other booth exchanged looks, their smirks fading. Sarah's lighthearted defense had flipped the attention. What was meant to humiliate David was now a moment of laughter with him, not at him. The diners who had been quick to snicker were now amused by Sarah's boldness instead. David eased back into his seat. pretending to sip his coffee while he gathered himself. The warmth in his chest wasn't from the drink, it was from Sarah's effortless kindness. She hadn't let the world laugh at him alone. She had pulled him back from the edge of shame with a joke. Simple as that. Sarah went back to the counter, grabbing a fresh pot of coffee. When she returned to top up his cup, she leaned closer. "See? Nothing to it," she whispered. "Note, don't let them get to you." David glanced at her, his voice low. "They always get to me." Her hand paused on the coffee pot, and for a moment she just looked at him. Then she smiled gently. "Not when I'm around." David lowered his eyes, unable to respond. The words meant more than she could know. At a booth near the window, a group of teenagers had been watching. They whispered to each other, one of them saying, "She really likes that guy." Another giggled, covering her mouth. Sarah overheard, but she ignored it. She wasn't embarrassed by kindness. To keep the mood light, she came back with a small plate holding a slice of pie. She set it in front of David before he could protest. "What's this?" he asked. "Emergency pie," she said. "Doctor's orders. If you almost trip in public, you're required to eat one slice of pie to restore your dignity." David laughed softly, shaking his head. "You're making that up, am I?" she asked, raising her eyebrows playfully. "Never." No. The room had settled now. Cruel laughter had faded, replaced with casual chatter. But the people who had laughed at first now kept sneaking glances toward David and Sarah. They noticed how she treated him, not with pity, but with respect wrapped in humor. Some of them felt a twinge of guilt. Others stayed stubborn, unwilling to admit their own cruelty. David ate the pie slowly, each bite filling more than just his stomach. It felt like a gift, a reminder that not everyone wanted to see him small. Sarah checked on other tables, but she kept an eye on him too, making sure he didn't sink back into the weight of silence. After a while, David stood again, this time careful, moving slowly to steady himself. Sarah, pretending to be on alert, rushed over dramatically. "Don't worry, folks, I've got him," she said, grabbing his arm with exaggerated effort. A few customers chuckled again, but now the tone was different. Even David laughed this time, shaking his head as he muttered, "You're going to make me famous in this town." "Too late," she replied. "You already are." He sat back down, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a man everyone dismissed. For a moment, he was part of the room, not just the shadow in the corner booth. The diner buzzed with life again, plates clattering, conversations overlapping, the hum of small-town mornings carrying on as usual. Under it all, the memory of laughter had shifted. It no longer belonged to the cruel whispers of strangers. It belonged to Sarah's fearless kindness, to the way she lifted him not with strength, but with spirit. David sipped his coffee, looking at her as she wiped down a table and laughed at a joke from another customer. He wondered why she cared, why she bothered with him when no one else did. Maybe it was just her nature. Maybe it was something more. But whatever it was, it made the coldness of the world outside feel a little less heavy. For the rest of that morning, he sat quietly, listening not to the laughter that once stung, but to the sound of plates, voices, and Sarah's voice ringing, clear above it all, bright, warm, unashamed. And though he left no sign of it, deep inside, he carried a piece of that warmth with him, holding on to it like a secret. The morning inside the diner carried on as it always did. Cups clinked, forks scraped against plates, and the hum of conversations filled the air. David sat quietly in his corner booth, finishing the last bites of the pie Sarah had insisted he eat. For a brief while, he felt lighter than usual, the sting of earlier laughter softened by her kindness. He still noticed the occasional glance from other tables, but he ignored it. He had learned long ago that people's opinions didn't feed him, didn't keep him warm at night. Still, a part of him wished he could disappear. Sarah walked past, balancing another tray, and gave him one of her quick, reassuring smiles. That small gesture kept him steady. He turned back toward the window, watching cars roll down the street outside. The sky was still gray, with the promise of rain hanging heavy. And then, the bell above the door jingled again. David barely looked up at first, People came and went all the time, but the shift in the room was impossible to ignore. Conversations halted mid-sentence, forks stopped moving, and every head turned toward the door. Even Sarah froze in place for half a second before quickly composing herself. A man had walked in. He wasn't dressed like anyone else in the diner, where most wore simple jackets, work boots, and uniforms. This man wore a tailored suit that looked sharp enough to belong in a city boardroom, not a small-town diner. His shoes shined as if they had never seen dust. He carried himself with calm confidence, every step measured, every gesture controlled. He had the air of someone important, someone used to being noticed, and noticed he was. Whispers spread quickly, soft but urgent. People leaned across booths, muttering to each other. "Is that him?" someone asked. "It can't be," another whispered. But it was. Several people recognized the face instantly. Richard, a name spoken often in newspapers, on television, even in stories told by hopeful dreamers. Richard was a billionaire, self-made, known for his massive company and the fortune he had built from nothing. More than that, he was a philanthropist, a man who had given millions away to hospitals, schools, and charities. He was famous for his wealth but respected for his generosity, and here he was, walking into a little diner in the middle of nowhere. The customers stared openly now. Some adjusted their posture, suddenly aware of their messy hair or worn clothes. A few women pulled out their phones under the table, pretending not to snap a picture. Even the two men who had mocked David earlier sat up straighter, their laughter gone, their faces caught somewhere between awe and nervousness. Sarah blinked, holding the tray tighter. She had seen important people before, but not like this. Someone this powerful, this widely known. Her heart thudded in her chest, though she forced herself to keep moving. The door closed softly behind Richard, and for a moment silence blanketed the diner. All eyes followed as he scanned the room. His gaze was calm, steady, as though he were looking for someone specific. David finally looked up, expected to see another stranger he had no business caring about. But when his eyes met Richard's, his chest tightened, his breath caught. He blinked once, twice, almost convinced his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. Richard's lips curved into a smile. Not the kind of polite smile given to strangers, but one of recognition, of warmth. Without hesitation, he walked past the counter, past the whispering tables, and headed straight toward David's corner booth. The whole diner watched, stunned. When he reached the booth, Richard extended a hand. "David," he said warmly, "it's been far too long." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. People craned their necks, eyes widening. David, the quiet man in the worn jacket, so when they laughed at moments ago, this billionaire knew him personally. David stared at Richard's hand, then slowly reached out, shaking it. His hand was rough, calloused from years of labor, while Richard's was smooth, firm, practiced in boardrooms and meetings. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. "Richard," David said softly, his voice carrying disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you," Richard replied. As if it were the simplest truth in the world, Sarah stood frozen nearby, the tray in her hands forgotten. She glanced between the two men, trying to process what she was seeing. The same man she had just helped when others mocked him was being greeted by one of the richest men in the country, like an old friend. The whispers around the diner grew louder. "How do they know each other?" someone asked. "Is he serious?" another muttered. The two young men who had laughed earlier exchanged nervous looks, their smugness replaced with discomfort. The weight of their earlier cruelty now hung heavier than ever. David shook his head slightly, still stunned. I don't understand. It's been years." "Yes, too many," Richard said, sliding into the booth across from him without waiting for an invitation. "I've been searching for. You didn't make it easy." David leaned back, his heart pounding. Memories stirred, ones he had long buried beneath silence and years of struggle. Memories of days when he and Richard were side by side, when they dreamed big dreams, when the world hadn't yet turned against him. Sarah, finally finding her voice, set the tray down at an empty table and approached cautiously. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?" she asked. Richard turned to her with a polite smile. "Coffee, please. Black." Her hands trembled slightly as she scribbled the order. She hurried toward the counter, still stealing glances at the booth in disbelief. Back at the booth, David stared at Richard with a mix of awe and suspicion. "Why now?" he asked quietly. "Why come here?" "Because I owe you," Richard said firmly, his voice carrying weight. "More than I can ever repay." The diner had fallen nearly silent again, every ear tuned to the conversation. They didn't dare miss a word. David opened his mouth, then closed it. He wanted to argue, to say he didn't deserve such words, but deep down he knew what Richard meant. The memories of their past burned brighter now, the choices they had made, the sacrifices. Sarah returned with the coffee, setting it carefully in front of Richard. Lingered a second, her curiosity almost unbearable, but she forced herself. Back to the counter. Richard sipped the coffee, then leaned forward. "I can't believe I found you here.
Yes.
I was starting to think you had disappeared forever." David lowered his eyes, staring at his own half-empty cup. "Maybe I wanted to disappear." "Well," Richard said softly, "that ends today." And with those words, the diner, once a place where David blended into the background, had transformed. The customers who once laughed at him now sat stunned, whispering to each other about the man they thought they knew in the billionaire, who had just walked in to change everything. For David, the world felt like it had shifted beneath his feet. He didn't know whether to be afraid or hopeful. All he knew was that the past he had tried so hard to bury had just walked through the door and found him. The diner felt heavier than before, as though every person inside was holding their breath. David sat across from Richard, still trying to make sense of what was happening. Only minutes ago, he had been the man everyone whispered about, the one people laughed at when he stumbled. Now the richest man anyone in that town had ever seen was sitting across from him like an old friend. Speaking as though they had unfinished business, Richard rested his coffee cup on the table, his eyes steady. "You haven't changed as much as you think, David," he said gently. "You're still the same man who carried me through the hardest times of my life." David shook his head, almost bitterly. "Oh, that man disappeared a long time ago. You don't know what my life's been like." "I know enough," Richard said firmly. "And I know why you're here, living like this, because of me." The words drew an even deeper silence. Sarah, who had been pretending to polish the counter, froze mid-motion, her heart beating faster, wanted to hear more, though she knew it wasn't her place. Everyone in the diner leaned closer, ears straining. David's jaw tightened. He didn't want this conversation in front of so many eyes, but Richard had never been one to worry about what others thought. "You remember the company?" Richard began, his voice calm, almost storytelling. "When we started, it was nothing. 2 kids with a borrowed office space, 1 old computer, and more dreams than sense. We didn't have money. We didn't have investors. All we had was each other." David nodded faintly, memories tugging at him. He remembered those nights, sleeping on the floor, eating cheap noodles, working until his eyes burned. He remembered Richard's endless energy, his belief that they could turn nothing into something. But when things got bad, Richard continued. "When the bills piled up and the bank was ready to shut us down, you were the one who made the choice. You gave up your share. You walked away so that I could keep the company alive. Do you have any idea what that meant to me?" David's eyes lowered to the table. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "It meant I lost everything. That's what it meant." Richard leaned closer, his tone firm but not unkind. "No, it meant I was able to build something. It meant the company survived because of your sacrifice. Every success I've had since then is because of what you gave up. You think you lost?" "Everything, David. But you gave me everything." The words hung in the air like a weight. The people in the diner shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were witnesses to something much larger than gossip. Even the 2 men who had mocked David earlier now looked ashamed, their faces red as they stared down at their plates. Sarah's chest ached as she listened. She glanced at David, seeing the pain in his eyes. To her, he wasn't just the quiet man in the corner booth anymore. He was someone who had given away a future most people could only dream of. David let out a shaky breath. "I didn't do it for thanks, Richard. I did it because someone had to." "I thought maybe you." could make something of it, and you did. Look at you now. His voice cracked. And look at me. Richard's eyes softened. And look at me, he repeated quietly. I've been standing on a mountain built by your sacrifice, but standing there alone has never felt right. I've spent years giving money away, building charities, trying to make the world better. But I've always known the one person who deserved the most from me was gone. Until now, David shook his head again. I don't want your pity. I don't want handouts. That's not why I did it. This isn't pity, Richard said, his voice rising just enough for the whole diner to hear. It's gratitude. It's justice. You gave up your future so I could have mine. Don't let that go unanswered. Sarah's throat tightened as she watched David's face. He wanted to be strong, to push away the offer. But there was something in his eyes, something tired, something that had carried too many years of struggle that betrayed him. Richard leaned back slightly, lowering his voice again, though it was still clear enough for the closest tables to catch. I came here to find you, David, because I need you beside me again. Not as charity, as my partner, as my equal. You've always been that, whether the world knew it or not. David blinked, stunned. The word partner rang in his ears. For years he had been invisible, surviving one day at a time. Now, here was Richard, offering him back the very thing he thought was lost forever. The room remained tense, silent except for the hum of the lights above. Sarah held her breath, waiting for David to speak. I don't know if I can, David finally whispered. I don't know if I belong in that world anymore. Look at me, Richard. Do I look like someone who belongs in boardrooms and skyscrapers? I can barely stand without stumbling. Richard smiled faintly, shaking his head. You don't have to look the part. You are the part. You always were. I wouldn't be where I am if not for you. No. And if I've learned anything, it's that. Appearances mean nothing. The people in this room judged you by your clothes, by your silence. But I know the truth. You're the man who saved me. And I won't let the world laugh at you while I sit on top of everything you helped build. The words cut through the air, silencing even the faintest whispers. Those who had laughed earlier now looked as though they wanted to sink through the floor. Sarah's eyes glistened, though she quickly blinked the tears away. Pretending to busy herself with a coffee pot, David swallowed hard, unable to speak. For so long he had lived believing his choices had left him forgotten, a shadow of what he once was. To hear Richard say these things, it was like someone had finally lit a candle in a room he thought would stay dark forever. Richard placed a hand on the table, steady and sure. Come with me, David. Let's finish what we started. David didn't answer right away. His mind was a storm, filled with memories, doubts, hopes he didn't dare hold on to. He glanced out the window again, the gray sky reflecting his confusion. Then his eyes shifted to Sarah, who stood behind the counter, watching quietly. Her expression wasn't one of pity, but of pride, of encouragement. She smiled softly, as if to say, "You deserve this." David turned back to Richard, his lips parting, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't ready to say yes, not yet. But, for the first time in years, he wasn't ready to say no either. The diner was no longer just a place of whispers and laughter at his expense. It had become the stage for the truth to finally come out, the truth about who David really was, and the sacrifice he had made. And though he hadn't answered Richard yet, everyone in that diner knew one thing for certain. The man they had mocked was no ordinary man at all. David sat across from Richard, his mind still spinning from the revelations. For years he had lived in the shadows unnoticed, overlooked and judged by everyone around him. Yet here he was, the quiet man in the corner booth, being offered a chance to reclaim a future he had long given up on. He could hardly believe it. Richard leaned back, his eyes calm but intense. I want you with me, David. Not as someone to rescue or pity, but as a partner. Everything I've built, everything I've accomplished, it's because of you. And now, I want us to finish what we started together. David shook his head, struggling to find the words. I don't know if I can. I've broken for so long, this world. It's not for people like me anymore. I've forgotten how to belong there. Richard's smile was gentle. You belong there because you helped create it. You always belonged, whether you knew it or not. David looked around the diner. The customers who had mocked him earlier sat quietly, heads lowered. Some avoided eye contact entirely, the embarrassment on their faces impossible to ignore. Sarah, standing behind the counter, watched him with a quiet intensity. Her small, supportive smile reminded him that not everyone in the world judged so easily. She had believed in him when no one else did. Slowly, David's eyes met Richard's. "And what about them?" he asked, gesturing toward the diners. "All the people who laughed at me? All the people who never saw me?" Richard chuckled softly. "They'll learn. Some of them already have, and those who don't. It doesn't matter. What matters is what we do next. Your past, my past, it's all led to this moment. It's time we move forward." David swallowed hard. For so long, he had lived day by day, never expecting anything better. And now, suddenly, the door to a new life had swung wide open. He could step through it, reclaim the dignity and respect he had long been denied. He could finally be seen for who he truly was, not just as the man people whispered about in corners. Sarah's presence was comforting. She had stayed by his side without judgment, even when the room laughed at him. She hadn't treated him like a failure, and now, seeing him offered this chance, she nodded subtly, as if to say, "This is your moment. Take it." David's chest tightened. He had so many doubts, so many fears, but one thing was clear. He couldn't stay in that corner booth forever. He had to move forward, even if it scared him. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "All right. I'll do it. I'll come with you." Richard's eyes lit up and a broad smile spread across his face. "Good. You won't regret it." The diner seemed to breathe a collective sigh. Even the people who had judged David felt something shift in the room. The man they had laughed at, mocked, and dismissed was not the same man anymore. He was someone with history, with courage, with sacrifice that had changed lives in ways they could never imagine. As Richard stood, David rose with him. The moment felt surreal. The man who had stumbled moments ago was now standing tall, ready to walk into a future he had almost forgotten existed. Richard turned to the diners. "Everyone," he said, his voice commanding attention without arrogance. "I want you to understand something. The man you laughed at, the one you underestimated, is the reason I am where I am today. He sacrificed everything so that a dream could live. He deserves more than your laughter. He deserves respect, admiration, and a chance to shine. And today, he's getting it." The room fell silent. No one spoke. Heads lowered in shame, eyes wide with realization. Some of the women who had whispered about David earlier looked guilty. Others murmured apologies under their breath. The young men who had laughed at him didn't know where to look. They had spent years judging someone without understanding the depth of his character. Sarah stepped closer to David. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded, feeling the weight of the moment, the depth of the shift in the room. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Thanks to you." Sarah smiled, relieved. She had always known he deserved better than the whispers and laughter. Now he was finally being given the chance to claim it. Richard led David out of the diner. The bell above the door jingled, but this time it was different. It didn't announce someone ordinary walking in. It announced transformation. It announced the beginning of a life David had almost forgotten existed. Outside, the sun was breaking through the clouds. The gray morning had given way to a soft, golden light, illuminating the small town in a way that felt almost symbolic. David took a deep breath, feeling the warmth on his face. It was the first time in years he felt hope. Real hope. Richard clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "This is it," he said. "New chapter." David nodded. "New chapter," he echoed, feeling the words settle inside him like a promise. Back in the diner, Sarah returned to her work, but the memory of the moment lingered. She knew she had witnessed something extraordinary, a life being rewritten before her eyes. She smiled quietly, knowing she had played a small part in supporting someone who had long deserved recognition. The people who had mocked David were still silent. Some were ashamed, others reflective. The lesson had been clear. Appearances could deceive, laughter could wound, and kindness could reveal truths no one else saw. David and Richard got into Richard's sleek black car, and as they drove away, David looked back at the diner one last time. The place where he had been laughed at, where whispers had followed him like shadows, now felt like a stepping stone rather than a cage. He had left behind judgment, cruelty, and doubt. He had stepped into a world where he was seen, appreciated, and valued. Richard glanced at him, smiling. Ready for what's next? David nodded again. I'm ready. The car rolled down the quiet streets of the town, sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating a path forward.
Out.
David felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a clarity in his chest. For the first time in years, he believed in the possibility of a future filled with respect, opportunity, and purpose. And though the road ahead was unknown, David no longer felt alone. He had Richard by his side, and he had the validation that came from finally being seen for who he truly was. The laughter that once humiliated him had been replaced with understanding, respect, and the recognition of sacrifice that changed lives. The diner faded behind them. The memory stayed alive in David's heart. It wasn't just a place where he had been laughed at. It was the place where he had begun to rise, where a single act of kindness had reminded him that he mattered. As they drove toward the future, David felt a sense of freedom he had never known. The journey ahead would have challenges, but for the first time, he faced them with confidence. He knew his worth, he knew his strength, and he knew that his past sacrifices were not in vain. The world was wide open now, and David was ready to step fully into it.